The Red Army, or Krasnaya Armia, was formed after the former Imperial Russian Army crashed to the ground in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1916. The Red Army rose out of the ashes in 1918 to defend the Bolshevik government during the Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1918 to 1920. The Red Army was the fighting force of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. After the Russian Civil War, peace came to Russia, but only for a while. The trouble came from within Russia, with the Purge. The Purge had left the Red Army devastated. In 1937, 8 generals and thousands of officers who were plotting to betray the Soviet Union to Germany were rounded up and killed, including the People's Commissar of War. Stalin knew that Europe was on the brink of war and opposition to the motherland was unacceptable in his eyes. Stalin was right with his predictions because in September of 1939, Russia entered what would become known as the Great Patriotic War. Russia first entered with Germany because in August of 1939, Germany and Russia had signed a treaty of non-aggression set to last for 10 years. Stalin quickly realized that signing a treaty with Hitler was a bad idea. The Schutzstaffel branch of the Wehrmacht, more commonly known by their double lightning bolt symbol, was rounding up and killing civilians in the countries they were invading. So many civilians had died in various countries that even the soldiers in the Wehrmacht disapproved of Hitler's orders. Stalin saw that there was no need for Hitler to kill these innocent men, women, and children. He knew that he could not trust Hitler, and in 1941, Stalin ordered the Red Army to set up inside Russia in a position to push into the heart of the Third Reich and end Germany's reign of terror. Germany, however, was not planning to honor their agreement. In 1941, as the Russians were setting up their armies to attack Germany, Hitler sent various armies to push into Russia. Due to unready officers hastily making decisions and Russia's armies being in a poor position for defense, the Red Army suffered devastating losses at the beginning of the war. The rest of the Allies were preoccupied with fighting the Germans trying to attack them, leaving Russia to fend for itself. The Red Army started a massive retreat called Scorched Earth. As the Red Army retreated, the soldiers destroyed anything that could be of use to the Germans. They tore down bridges, ripped up railroad tracks, and poisoned water supplies in an attempt to stop the advancing German war machine. The Germans did not know what they were dealing with. The Führer, who expected that Russia would fall by winter, had not issued winter clothing to Germany's bravest. The Germans could not do a thing to prevent the winter from coming. The Wehrmacht was completely unprepared for the winter ahead. Their men were freezing in their sleep, their gasoline frozen as containers. Daily temperatures reached negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They did not have enough food, and clean water was difficult to come by, because the Russians had poisoned most of it in their retreat. The Russians did not suffer so badly, because they were issued warm winter clothing. The Germans quickly rushed to attack Stalingrad and push on to capture Moscow so that they could leave Russia as soon as possible. Stalingrad was a Russian city which produced armaments and tractors. The city was important to the Russians because of this. The Germans wanted to take the city both for its factories and as a trophy of war. In August of 1942, the Germans began an attack on Stalingrad, the outcome of which changed the entire war. The Russians, knowing an attack was coming, had tried to set up defensive positions around the city. The men were all given weapons and training to defend their city. The women dug anti-tank trenches around Stalingrad to prevent the German tanks from reaching the city easily. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, started to drop incendiary bombs on the city. Most of the wooden buildings in the city burned down. The Germans resorted to this because they wanted to take the city as soon as possible because they didn't want to deal with another winter in Russia. The Red Army managed to keep the Germans at bay until the approach of the next winter. The leader of the Germans, Friedrich Paulus, told Hitler that they did not want to suffer for another winter in Russia. Hitler's response was, "You and your men must stand and fight." Once again, the Germans were dreadfully unprepared for the winter. The few supplies they actually had, they gained by looting Russian villages and killing all the civilians who lived there. These supplies didn't last long, and the Germans were again plagued by hunger, frozen in their sleep, and losing limbs to frostbite. On February 2nd, 1943, the Germans could not take the Russian winter anymore. Friedrich Paulus, 24 German generals, and 91,000 German troops surrendered to the Red Army. The remaining Germans in Russia were also defeated at Moscow, and they had one place to go, back towards Germany. Many Russians believe today that Stalingrad was the greatest victory of the Great Patriotic War. Hitler lost an army, and the Russians defended their city to the death, and forced the Germans to turn and flee in the direction of the Allies. One of the more important locations of the battle was called Pavlov's house. A platoon under Yakov Pavlov turned an abandoned apartment building with a 1-kilometer line of sight to the north, south, and west into an impenetrable fortress. The soldiers created machine gun points out many windows facing the street. The building was surrounded by 4 layers of barbed wire and a minefield at Pavlov's orders. On the roof of the building, a soldier manned a PTRS-41 anti-tank rifle. Pavlov took out nearly a dozen tanks himself by shooting through the thin armor on the top of the turret. The Germans tried to take the building many times a day, but were forced to retreat every time by a hail of machine gun and anti-tank rifle fire. Over the course of the battle, Pavlov and his men had to go out daily to remove as many corpses as possible so that the Germans could not use the bodies of their comrades as cover. Supplies were brought in through a secured trench. The Germans could not take Pavlov's house, no matter how hard they tried. Stalin was furious that Hitler had tried to take over Russia, and quickly joined the Allies in a massive push towards Germany to end the Third Reich. In 1945, an important decision had to be made. The Allies were all in some sort of position to attack Berlin, but they did not know who should attack. Russia was really the only logical choice, because the Americans were 50 miles away, the Russians were closer, and they had the manpower and the machinery to get the job done. In April of 1945, the Russians pushed into Berlin. On the day after Hitler's birthday, April 21st, 1945, the Red Army decided to give Hitler a present, thousands of artillery shells right into the heart of Berlin. This was extremely frustrating to the Fuhrer, who had made his last public appearance the day before to award volunteer boys the Iron Cross for defending Berlin. These boys were not actually volunteers at all. They would be strung up on the nearest light post or tree for treason if they had refused to fight. Then, on April 25th, the Red Army stormed Berlin. They smashed the German lines of defense so that their soldiers could go through. The Red Army employed a different fighting style this time around. They wanted to get the job done and as thoroughly as possible. The Russians fought house to house, one rifle regiment assigned to a street with more troops in reserve. They cleared out many pockets of resistance, though some were able to hold out until Germany's surrender. Many divisions headed to the Reichstag, Germany's chancellery building. The first attempt to take the building failed. The Red Army came back, this time with more men and now tanks. The Germans were able to disable some of the tanks with flak guns situated on a tower in the Berlin Zoo. They could do nothing to stop the Red Army's soldiers inside the building. A Red Banner party from the 150th Rifle Division, managed to secure a back stairway in the building, and at around 11 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, they managed to plant the Soviet flag on top of the Reichstag. That same day, Adolf Hitler committed suicide as the Red Army came knocking on the front door of the Führer bunker. On the evening of May 1st, 1945, the Germans offered to begin surrender negotiations as soon as possible. Fighting still continued, but most of the Red Army troops were celebrating May Day. The only troops who were fighting were those trying to eliminate the tiny pockets of resistance that were still spread out throughout the city. The Red Army had won. Germany had surrendered. The Führer had killed himself, and the crumbling Third Reich surrendered. The German war machine had finally stopped working. Among the other accomplishments of the Red Army is the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest extermination camp that was ever built by the Nazis. The Red Army also freed those imprisoned at many other camps. The Red Army had fought the Germans for almost 3 years in Russia with very little assistance from the Allies, and they pushed them back to Germany to eventually win the war.